They wrote it down. That's the thing. Not just the cover-up, the strategy behind it. A government official, sometime in the 1960s, sat down and committed it to paper. Recording radiation doses in military service files, the memo warned, would gravely handicap the government in defending future pension claims. Because if medical opinion ever shifted on what those doses caused, the records would be actionable in court. The solution was clean. Don't record the doses. That memo exists. It's been partially released. The author's identity is still redacted. And as of 2025, the strategy it described has held for over 60 years. This is the story of approximately 20,000 British servicemen, 45 nuclear tests, and a government that decided the cheapest way to avoid paying them was to make sure they could never prove what happened to their bodies. Between 1952 and 1967, the United Kingdom conducted nuclear weapons tests across 2 continents. The sites were chosen for distance: Montebello Islands off Western Australia, Emu Field in the South Australian desert, Maralinga, Christmas Island in the Pacific, Malden Island. The test series had names that sounded almost ceremonial: Hurricane, Totem, Buffalo, Antler, Grapple. Britain was building its nuclear deterrent, proving it could sit at the table with the Americans and the Soviets, and it needed men on the ground to make that happen. The men it sent were not nuclear specialists. They were national servicemen, RAF ground crew, Royal Engineers, Royal Navy ratings, men in their late teens and early 20s who received a posting the same way they'd receive any other posting. You're going to the Pacific for a few months. You're going to Australia. The work is classified, but the radiation is within safe limits. Your government will look after you. Operation Grapple alone put approximately 8,000 servicemen on Christmas Island during the hydrogen bomb tests of 1957 and 1958. They watched the detonations from open beaches. Most of them were not given dosimetry badges. The ones who were told this was for their protection were not given the full version of that explanation. The full version came in a 1958 memo from Air Vice Marshal John Grandy to the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment. Grandy explained why dosimetry badges were not being issued to Christmas Island personnel. Issuing them, he wrote, may well provoke anxiety. Read that again slowly. The badges were withheld, not because the doses were negligible. If the doses were negligible, there would be nothing to be anxious about. The badges were withheld because the doses were high enough that men who knew their readings might ask questions, might refuse duty, might, at some later point, have documented evidence of what their bodies absorbed. Grandy later became Chief of the Air Staff, then Chief of the Defense Staff. The memo was obtained decades later through a Freedom of Information request and published by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. At Maralinga in 1956, during Operation Buffalo, servicemen were ordered to advance toward Ground Zero within hours of detonation. Standard military uniforms, no respirators, no protective suits. The 1985 McClelland Royal Commission, an Australian government inquiry into British nuclear testing on Australian soil, found serious safety failures across the program. It also found that Aboriginal communities living downwind of the South Australian tests had received no warning and no evacuation. The British government paid Australia £20 million in 1988 to help clean up Maralinga. It paid nothing to the British servicemen who had stood in the same fallout. Now here's where the architecture of the cover-up becomes clear. The 1958 Grandy memo established that dose information would not be given to the men at the time. The 1960s pension liability memo established that dose information would not be recorded in their service files for the future. These weren't separate decisions made by different departments. They were 2 components of the same strategy. No badge at the test site meant no reading. No reading recorded in the service file meant no document for a future court to examine. No document meant no case. You see, the cover-up wasn't just about hiding what happened. It was about making what happened legally unprovable. The 1998 cohort study, published in the British Medical Journal, found elevated rates of leukemia and multiple myeloma among nuclear test participants compared to matched military controls. Elevated. The government disputed the methodology. and the government had a structural argument available to it that the researchers couldn't fully answer. Without individual dose records, you cannot establish the dose-response relationship that courts require. You can show that more test veterans got leukemia than the control group. You cannot prove for any specific veteran that his specific exposure caused his specific cancer, because his specific exposure was never recorded. By design. In 2009, the Court of Appeal ruled that veterans' claims were not automatically time-barred. It opened a path. Over 1,000 veterans filed compensation claims. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled 4-3 that those claims were time-barred under the Limitation Act. The government stated it had no plans to pay compensation. The United States passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act in 1990. Canada has a scheme. France has a scheme. The UK does not. Then came 2018. Thousands of documents in the AB and ES archive series, covering atomic energy and experimental stations, were quietly withdrawn from the National Archives for what the government described as a security review. No expected return date was given. The documents simply left. In 2023, a man named Alan Owen filed a Freedom of Information request to the Atomic Weapons Establishment at Aldermaston. Owen had founded LabRats, Legal Action for British Nuclear Test Survivors, in 2021. He had been methodically working through the AWE's holdings. The response to his FOI told him that 150 documents existed in the relevant files. 3 were publicly available. The titles of the withheld documents read like the suppressed medical history of the entire program: blood count irregularities, blood counts at Maralinga, dose record Grapple Z. Owen told Parliament directly, "The minister said there were no medical records in here, yet there are." A parallel investigation by the Mirror surfaced additional hidden documents showing the MOD had known for decades that hundreds of servicemen had blood tests taken while being deliberately exposed to fallout. The veterans' own blood samples, collected at the time, had been reclassified as scientific data and placed under MOD custody at AWE Aldermaston. The men whose bodies produced those samples cannot legally access them. In November 2023, MPs debated nuclear test veterans' medical records in Westminster Hall. They cited the 150 AWE documents. They cited the 3 that were publicly available. They cited the 147 that weren't. The government's position was that the records were held appropriately. Owen's position was that the minister had misled Parliament. A new legal action seeking court-ordered access to the AWE records was launched in September 2023. As of 2025, an estimated 1,500 of the original 20,000 veterans are still alive. The 147 documents remain classified. The compensation scheme does not exist. The men are still waiting. The official who wrote the 1960s pension liability memo made a precise calculation. Record the doses, and future courts can use those records against you. Don't record them, and the men can never prove their case. The Supreme Court confirmed the logic in 2012, 4 votes to 3. The strategy worked exactly as designed. The only thing that memo's author didn't calculate was that someone would eventually find the memo. The documents that surfaced through Owen's FOI campaign didn't just reveal what was hidden, they revealed the shape of what's still missing. When you look at the 3 publicly available files against the 147 that aren't, you're looking at a deliberate ratio. 3 documents released is not transparency. It's the appearance of transparency. It's enough to say the archive exists, that it's being managed responsibly, that the government is not hiding anything. The 147 withheld files are the answer to that claim. And the titles matter. Blood count irregularities is not a document about administrative procedure. Dose record Grapple Z is not a general scientific report. These are specific medical findings attached to a specific test series involving specific men. Grapple Z was the final test in the Christmas Island hydrogen bomb program, detonated in April 1958. The men on that island, during that detonation, are the men whose dose records are sitting in a classified file at Aldermaston right now. Some of them are in the 1,500 still alive. Most of them are not. The biological samples compound this. Blood and urine collected from servicemen during and after the tests, taken by government doctors at government facilities, now classified as scientific data owned by the MOD, not medical records belonging to a patient. Scientific data belonging to an institution. That reclassification is not semantic, it is the legal mechanism that keeps those samples out of reach. A veteran cannot request his own blood work, his GP cannot request it on his behalf. A court has not yet ordered its release. The September 2023 legal action is attempting to change that. As of this recording, it has not succeeded. There is a comparison that puts the British position in sharp relief. The United States created the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act in 1990. It covers atomic veterans, downwinders, uranium miners. It has paid out over $2.5 billion in claims. It is not perfect. It has gaps, exclusions, funding disputes, but it exists. It is a formal acknowledgement by the US government that its nuclear program harmed the people who built and supported it, and that those people are owed something. Britain has watched that scheme operate for 35 years and has not built one. The argument the British government has consistently made is that the science is uncertain, that causation cannot be established, that the dose records don't exist, and therefore the link cannot be proven. What that argument omits is that the dose records don't exist because the government chose not to create them. The uncertainty is not a natural feature of the evidence. It was manufactured. The 1960s memo proves the manufacture was deliberate. Ken McGinley spent years as president of the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association, pressing this case publicly, watching men he served with die without acknowledgement. He described the experience of veterans who went to their GPs with cancers, with blood disorders, with the elevated rates of leukemia that the 1998 BMJ study confirmed, and were told there was no way to connect their condition to their service. No way, because the connection had been administratively severed before it could be made. That is the specific cruelty of this particular cover-up. It wasn't just that the government denied the harm. It's that the government designed a system in which the harm could not be formally established, then used the absence of formal establishment as its defense. The circularity is not accidental. It's the point. The 2018 archive withdrawal deserves more attention than it typically receives. Documents pulled from the National Archives for a security review in 2018, 7 decades after the tests began, with no return date given. What national security concern requires reclassifying records from 1952? The weapons designs are long obsolete. The test sites are decommissioned. The only live security concern those documents could threaten is the government's legal exposure. That is not a national security concern. That is a Treasury concern. And the distinction matters, because the Official Secrets Act and national security classifications are being used to protect a financial position, not a military one. The parliamentary debate in November 2023 was notable for what the MPs said, and for what the government did not concede. Multiple members cited Alan Owen's findings directly. They named the documents. They asked why 147 files remained classified. The government's response was that the AWE holds records appropriately and that there is no evidence of a systematic cover-up. Owen's response to that position was precise. The minister said there were no medical records in the AWE holdings. There are. One of those statements is wrong. What the veterans and their families are left with, in 2025, is a legal fight that has been running for over 30 years against an opponent with unlimited resources and a structural advantage built into the evidence base. The Supreme Court's 4-3 ruling in 2012 did not find that the veterans weren't harmed. It found that they had waited too long to sue. The Limitation Act set a time window. The veterans spent most of that window not knowing their dose records had been withheld. By the time the FOI releases confirmed the suppression, the window had closed. The strategy in the 1960s memo held. Janine Alice Smith, who campaigns for the veterans in Parliament and whose family has a direct connection to Maralinga, has described the fight as one that the government is simply waiting out. The men are in their 70s, 80s, 90s. Roughly 19,000 of the original 20,000 are already dead. Every year that passes without a compensation scheme is a year the government doesn't have to pay. The mathematics of delay are as deliberate as the mathematics of the original suppression. The 1960s memo's author calculated that without dose records, the government could defend pension claims. That calculation was correct. What it didn't account for was that the memo itself would eventually surface, that the document proving the strategy existed would become the clearest evidence of what the strategy was. The cover-up is documented by the document that designed the cover-up. 147 files remain classified at Aldermaston. The men whose blood is in those files are still alive, some of them still filing requests, still waiting for a court to order what the government won't give voluntarily. The official report on their service described the radiation as within acceptable limits. The acceptable limits were set by the same institution that decided not to measure what the men actually received.